November 2nd, 1957, Plainfield, Wisconsin. I turned the brass key in the rusted padlock behind Plainfield Community Hospital, and the morgue door answered with a ragged groan. The hinge complained like an old man. The sodium lamp on Pine Street blinked twice through frost and went dim. My name is Frank Mallory. That night I was meant to keep watch until 6 a.m. The room smelled of formaldehyde and ozone, a chemical pinch undercut by the dry iron tang of old blood. My gloves squeaked when I slipped them on. The stainless steel table felt like a promise of cold. My Elgin watch cooled against my wrist. My mother had died 3 weeks earlier. Grief is a weight you learn to carry, folded into routine. Roy Mathers stuck his head in the doorway with a cigarette still smoldering. "You talk to the dead, Mallory? Or you just scared of the dark?" he said, tapping the rail with an idle laugh. I answered with a shrug and a steadying breath. He left me the key and the joke. The joke sat heavy. They wheeled Ellen Pickford in at 0:05. The ambulance on Route 23 had an AM radio that hummed in the cab. The stretcher wheels whispered over the ramp. Ellen was the kind of woman who knitted blankets for babies on Pine Street. The drape smelled faintly of lavender when I pulled it back. Her left forearm bore tidy strips of skin torn back in thin, methodical bands. Not the ragged work of a dog, not the uneven chew of scavengers. I checked the scalpel tray. Blade number 10, number 11, a spare microblade marked micro, shoved beside forceps, stamped Forensic, 1949. The bone saw sat in its guard with dried residue along the rim. The old Eagle cooler hummed, and the thermostat on the wall read 36 degrees. The compressor clicked like a counting heart. The Philco radio on the shelf filled the room with static, and then a breath of something like a voice, barely there. "Find me." I told myself it was the wiring, a standing wave in the building's cloth-insulated cables. From the coffin storage came steps, slow, heavy, a rubber sole dragging along plywood. The pitch of it lodged in my teeth. I named it to myself. Delivery ramps settling, cold shrink rats. Naming sounds is what we do. If you can file them, you can fix them. I went toward the noise. The overhead GE fluorescent buzzed on a tired frequency. The latch on the storage door complained. The air carried a metallic note, copper and old leather, and my breath fogged like a lantern in the cold. My fingers felt thin, like wire. No one was there. Rows of coffins sat like sleeping animals. One crate had fresh scuffs at the edge. A smear of dark, dry blood cupped the plank. My heart stepped out of rhythm. Suddenly my ribs were a drum I couldn't quiet. I checked the breaker box in the corridor. The plate stamped Mortuary Proc. The 20-amp labeled prep lights held steady when I jiggled the switch. The BX cable above the radio crackled with old insulation. I noted each sound, each relay, because if you can name a fault, you can log it and keep the fear from widening its teeth. My gloved finger brushed Ellen's palm and the coin answered with a hard, small clink. A 1923 Liberty nickel lay between her dead fingers, edges worn smooth but not weathered into age, as if someone had polished it and placed it there. There was a faint smudge of fresh oil at its rim, like the mark of a leather glove. I sat on the corner of the prep table and opened my ledger, the stitched book I carried for times and tags. November 2nd, 1957, 0012. Ellen Pickford, coin found in palm. Liberty, 1923, note fresh oil smudge. I began writing a question that felt like a key. Why do some dead want to be found? Dr. Bennett came in to check the chart, eyes avoiding Ellen's face. He muttered about calls from Miller Road, trampled fences and missing stock. "Keep your notes tight, Frank," he said, voice low. I told Roy on the hospital extension that everything was routine. He laughed once and said, "Bring me a souvenir if you find anything interesting." My hands shook when I wiped them at the sink. The skin came away raw from the scrub. The stainless mirror over the basin reflected a face I couldn't unbundle. Exhaustion, grief, a thin sheen of fear across the eyes. I left the morgue at dawn with mist on my shoes and the coin humming in my pocket like a small accusation. I locked the padlock behind the door and the metal clicked into place. The sodium lamp on Pine Street cut a pale line through fog. The Philco on the shelf breathed static and then silence. I kept the ledger closed on the passenger seat of my Chevy, and I felt for the first time the true temperature of the town. This is the story of when the fear began, and why it never left. I couldn't force sleep that dirty November morning. The Elgin in my coat pocket kept perfect time while my head buzzed like a bad radio. I am Frank Mallory, and the fog on Main Street sat so thick it felt like a hand pressing at the windows of Joe's Diner. Roy Mathers laughed from across the Formica as if he could buy the whole town with a joke. "Morgue got ghosts now, Mallory?" he said, flicking ash into the saucer. I said nothing, because answering would have been confession, and I wasn't ready to admit the tremor in my hands. Back at Plainfield Community Hospital, the thermometer by the prep room door had a spiderweb crack, and the mercury was fractured into an uneven column. The GE fluorescent in the corridor hummed at a pitch that made the fillings in my teeth ache. Dr. Bennett slid the file toward me without meeting my eyes and murmured, "Miller Road reports more missing stock. Watch yourself, Frank." He said it like a fact, not a fear. I ran the inventory like a man performing a prayer. Scalpel number 10 in the tray, spare number 11, forceps stamped forensic 1949, bone saw in its guard with dried residue at the collar. Naming my tools steadied me. Technical lists keep the dark from claiming language. At midnight the steps returned, slow, deliberate, rubber sole on plywood, a sound that scraped at my molars. It wasn't the skitter of mice or the jitter of rats. It had the timing of a person testing a latch. Each drag measured a patience I didn't want to understand. The Philco on the shelf ate static and coughed out a whisper like a mouth closed by tape. "Find me." I turned the dial and the hiss folded around the words. The sound hit like a cold fingertip along the spine. I forced the rational explanations like a mechanic sourcing a fault. Old plumbing, a freezing delivery ramp, loose planks in the coffin storeroom. I thumbed the breakers in the box labeled mortuary proc. The 20 amp for the prep lights held when I wiggled it. The BX cable above the radio still crackled with aged insulation. My hands were a thermometer of their own, cold at the knuckles, a tremor that started at the fingertips and climbed my forearm. The air had that metallic tang, like coins and leather, and the weight of the silence pressed behind my sternum. Breaths came short, mechanical. I opened the small stitched ledger I kept in my inner coat and wrote in a blunt script, November 3rd, 1957, 012. Heard steps in coffin storage. Philco whisper, "Bind me." Then I added a question in my own language. Why do some dead want to be found? The Eagle cooler read 36 degrees on its dial, and the compressor clicked in a tired rhythm. I logged the temp and the sound. The freezer seals held tight. The thermometer in the prep room shivered, and I noted serial numbers and condition. Bone saw serial, Chirp B 1947, blade guard with residue, forceps with stamped ID. Precision was a shield. Guilt sat heavy beneath the apron like a damp rag. Dr. Bennett caught me once in the corridor and said, "You should take a day, Frank. Let it out of you before it eats you." I told him, "I don't know how to leave it on the table, Doc." He only sighed and crumpled another paper cup in his hand. Discipline kept me honest. Case numbers logged the way the coroner taught. Date, case, time. Chain of custody forms filled my desk drawer. Each signature I scrawled felt like bolting doors on a barn that might still be watched. Outside, Route 23 lay empty, and the sodium lamp on Pine Street blinked like a tired eye. Engines passed distant and solitary. One truck at dawn, the postman's Chevy at 9, and the wind carried ozone and the sour tang of old blood from the alley behind the hospital. The town smelled of winter and waiting. Roy's laugh echoed in my head all night. He left a message on the extension that lasted 5 seconds. "You keeping the lights on, Mallory? Call me if you find anything neat." When I rang him, the line went to dead air. The absence itself felt like an answer. I closed the ledger and taped the spine where the stitch had loosened. The entries formed a map I couldn't yet read. The sounds in the dark had a pattern, and patterns are instructions. Something old lay buried under Plainfield's polite lawns. My job taught me to mark what uncovers itself. The weight of the dead was no longer just on them. It sat on me, patient and waiting. The ambulance on Route 23 rolled like a slow confession into the morgue ramp. They wheeled William past the sodium-lit alley, and the fluorescent hum of the prep room felt suddenly too loud. "I am Frank Mallory." The tag said, Case 57-0111, received November 7th at 03:10. He smelled of farm smoke and old leather even under the hospital sheet. They had to bring him two at a time. William's stretcher bottomed and the orderlies cursed under their breath. His jacket was still buttoned when they slid him onto the stainless steel table. Corn chaff clung to the cuffs. The AM radio in the ambulance had been stuck on a farm report. That static became the prelude to a sound I couldn't unhear. When I drew the drape back, the pattern hit like a cold tool. Skin flayed in thin, neat strips along his forearms, ribboned back with the precision of repeated practice. This wasn't scavenging, it was work. I counted the marks with the same exactness I used in surgery. Note the arc, measure the depth, blade angle approximated at 30 degrees. I named instruments like a mechanic lists tools. Scalpel number 10 in the circular tray, spare number 11 beside it. Forceps stamped Forensic 1949 clamped and ready. The bone saw with serial /B 1947 sat in its guard, its blade ringed with old residue. Naming kept my hands from forgetting how to be steady. After I logged the case in the ledger, 11757 William Miller Road, I went down to the basement archives like a man going to check a fuse. Cardboard boxes were stamped Plainfield records on 1930s, and each one smelled of dust and damp glue. My flashlight cut a narrow cone through the air. The sodium lamp outside painted the room in a jaundiced light. I spread the photos on an oil-stained bench under the garage's hanging bulb and felt a hand of recognition. Photos from 1934 and 1937 showed the same looping, thin incisions, annotated by a clerk's careful hand. Dates and initials, A.J. Clark 37, scrawled at the margins. The pattern repeated across decades like a footpath worn into field sod. My mother used to hush me with stories about a man children called the Man with the Hat, a tale for daylight and for warning. "Don't go past the orchard at dusk," she'd say, tapping the back of her wrist. Those words returned now not as folklore but as coordinates. Orchard, Miller Road, a watchful hat silhouetted against the trees. I took the photos to Joe's diner and sat with Roy across cracked formica. I set one down. "See this?" I asked. He shrugged and pushed his cigarette ash into the saucer. "Folklore, Frank. People like patterns so they can sleep." He laughed, but the edge of that laugh felt like an admission. Roy called it nonsense. I didn't. The next morning I went out to the farmhouse at the edge of town with the farmer's lane behind it, choked with mud. The gate's latch hissed with old rust when I forced it open, and the barn door gave a protesting groan. Everything smelled of hay, diesel, and the damp iron of tools left overnight. Under a tarpaulin in the corner, I found a small brass medallion wrapped in a funeral ribbon, the same worn rose design my mother used to wear beneath her blouse. The clasp had a fresh oil smudge at the hinge, and my thumb left a print that showed up in the light like a fingerprint on glass. The medallion fit into a slot on the story the town didn't want to tell. I carried it back to the morgue and laid it beside the Liberty nickel I'd found in Ellen Pickford's palm. The coin had that same recent polish at the rim. The medallion had the same careful handling. The repetition felt intentional. A hand moving through private things and arranging evidence like a message. Then, later that night, they wheeled in another body from Miller Road. An unknown male, tag 57014, arrival 0120. The EMS driver kept his hands in his pockets and said, "Found him near the turn. Rain had him pinned to the ditch." I signed the call sheet and tried to breathe slow and measured. When I rolled back the sheet, the forearm was carved. Letters cut neatly into tendon and skin in a hand that didn't tremble. Not all sleep. The sight of it was a physical thing. My knees ceased to be obedient for a moment, and the room contracted to the size of my chest. I wrote the phrase in the margin of my ledger and boxed it like evidence. 11/8/57. Message carved, "Not all sleep." Sample to histology. My hands were steady when I labeled the jars. After a while, discipline becomes the only thing colder than fear. Still, the phrase sat under my ribcage like an ember. That night, alone at the prep table, I pressed my palm to the cool steel and listened. The Philco radio on the shelf offered only a whisper of static and the distant county report. But in the hush, I felt Plainfield's silence press down. Neighbors who stepped around missing names, officials who filed their forms and shut their doors. The marks on bodies were not just wounds, they were maps, and someone had been walking this town for a long time. November 16, 1957. The call came through at 03:40 a.m. Plainfield PD on the extension. Get down to Gyn property, Mallory. Bring ID and logbooks. I grabbed my Elgin and the brass key to the morgue like a man taking a sacrament and drove out along Route 23 into a night that smelled of diesel and cold iron. The farmhouse sat in the county lights like something dug up and left to stare. Patrol cars ringed the yard, searchlights painting the barn in white scars. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge. The smell that hit me when I stepped inside was leather and something sweeter and raw, like a beast burned and preserved at once. They wanted cataloging and identification. They wanted a steady hand to number things so the paperwork could hold a reality in place. I wrote case numbers 57016 through 57019 on the tag board, ink thick and deliberate. The tag board is a small anchor. Date, item, location, witness. Discipline is a chain. The chairs were the first thing that broke my orderly mind. Rib bones used as spindles, pelvis plates hammered into seats. A childhood fear felt ridiculous until you saw a dining room chair with a back sewn from pale skin and knew it occupied someone's kitchen once. The bone saw's residue in the blade guard matched a smear on the floor of the barn. On a nail hung a mask, stitched shut at the seam like an attempted face, its edges puckered with old varnish. The eye sockets were hollowed and roughly trimmed. For a moment I couldn't tell whether to catalogue it or to kneel. I chose cataloguing because that is what steadies you. Mask, tag M5702, condition, desiccated seams hand-sewn. The same Liberty nickel I'd found in Ellen Pickford's palm showed up on a shelf with other coins and keepsakes. The brass medallion from William's farmhouse sat in a cigar box with calling cards and a length of thread. It wasn't coincidence, it was pattern. Patterns are not accidents, they're plans left to rust. Doctor. Bennett stood near a pile of calling cards with a paper cup in his hand and a bottle hidden under his coat. He kept saying we needed samples to histology and then putting the cup to his lips. This is beyond pathology, he said once, voice hoarse. This is cultural. We have to register the social vectors. His hands trembled when he tried to steady a biopsy needle. I called Roy on the car phone and got a recorded click. His booth at Joe's was empty, his ashtray untouched. Later, a patrolman told me they'd found his name scrawled on a ledger in Gyn's barn, and then the page had been torn out. Missing people don't always show up as bodies. Sometimes they show up as holes in a roster. Some of the bodies had been moved or manipulated after death. Others bore signs that made my stomach drop, bruising and froth in the airways that read like life, tried and failed to keep going. Lungs with frothy fluid, contusions to the jaw, attempts to force air in or out. The words I recorded were clinical: asphyxia, aspiration, ante-mortem incision. They do not soften the sight of a person who fought to breathe. The incisions repeated a geometry I'd seen in the 1930s files under the morgue stairs. Looping arcs, thin measured cuts. I felt the old ledger's paper between my fingers as if it were the skin of a living thing. Whoever had done this had been taught to measure economy in the flesh. The lines were economical and ritualistic at once. Sleep evaporated into a series of bad fragments. I dreamt of my mother's kitchen roof collapsing and her calling my name from under the boards. I woke once choking, the taste of metal at the back of the throat, and for a long minute I couldn't tell if the Philco on the morgue shelf had said my name or if my guilt was learning to call itself. The sound on the radio shifted from static to breathier whispers. Between farm reports and county notices, I thought I heard cadence that matched my own. Frank. It was so faint I almost blamed the wiring, the cloth-insulated conduits in the hospital crawl space that sometimes sing when humidity changes. But calling it wiring is a neatness I stopped accepting. Captain Thomas Harrigan pressed a hand to the board and asked the question every man around him was trying to avoid. How deep does the silence go? I told him what I had logged: coin, medallion, masks, chairs, 5 items photographed and tagged, samples to histology. He rubbed his jaw and said, "We all looked the other way, Frank. Some of us for better reasons than others." In the end, I realized the horror wasn't only Ed Gaines' making. It was the town's catalogue of small refusals: a neighbor who didn't check the basement, an authority who filed a missing person report as wandered, a face turned downward at the supper table. When you add up those tiny silences, you have a place that breeds secrets. Ed Gein was the sharp edge. Plainfield was the grindstone that made it glint. The morning the papers put Gein's name in bold, I stood under the GE fluorescent over the prep room and watched the light hum like a thing with a pulse. I am Frank Mallory, and the Tribune's headline read like a verdict while my Elgin ticked steady on my wrist. November 18th, 1957. Ink on newsprint tries to tidy horror, but the barn smell, leather-scorched, mud, something preserved, had followed me back to the hospital. I found my mother's diary folded under a stack of unpaid utility bills on her kitchen table. Between a rhubarb pie recipe and a grocery list, she had written in an ink that was both strict and small: "The true monster is the one we invite in." Those words landed like an incision, precise, simple, unavoidable. I read them with the same attention I give to a case file. The necropsy window was spidered with hairline cracks from an old impact. My reflection there looked stitched into pieces by those fractures. For a moment I couldn't tell where the stainless steel pan on the table ended, and my face began. The glass made me feel like evidence myself, segmented, to be examined, catalogued. The Philco on the shelf in the corner kept a background hiss, and then, every so often, a cadence I'd swear matched my own breathing. "Frank," the speaker seemed to cough once, not a call, but an echo. I checked the wiring in the crawlspace, cloth-insulated NM cable, junction boxes with old tape, and named each fault like a talisman against panic. I walked through the evidence tags on the board: M5702, mask; B5703, rib chair, serial noted; personal effects: Liberty 1923 nickel, brass medallion. I wrote chain of custody entries with square, deliberate letters: date, item, location, witness. Keeping the log straight felt like holding the edge of something that could otherwise fall apart. Dr. Bennett came by with a thermos and a face that had folded in on itself. He said, "We have to be clinical, Frank. We have to be precise." His hand did a small, involuntary tremor when he reached for the microtome blade. The sight of a man like him losing his steadiness put a thin ice under my feet. I thought of the small cruelties I'd seen in Plainfield: neighbors who mistook asking for help as imposition, the county clerk who marked a disappearance with "wandered," a landlord who shrugged off late-night screams as a local dog. Those small refusals are mortar. I felt them when I lifted the stainless lid of the sample jar. The air smelled like formol and old omissions. Captain Thomas Harrigan stopped by the morgue and ran a hand along the tagboard. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice dry. I told him about the 1930s files, the repeated patterns, the medallion, the coin. He didn't answer with comfort. He said quietly, "People protect their own by looking away. It's simpler to keep the door shut." At night, the corridor lights on Pine Street blinked in slow sodium beats. The hospital's breaker, labeled mortuary proc, still read steady when I checked it: 20 amp for prep lights, spare fuses in the closet. I logged the readings. Discipline is a manual you follow even when the manual doesn't say what to do about ghosts. My hands grew cold in ways the thermostat could not measure. The metallic taste came back when I opened the cooler, 36-degree fires on the Eagle dial, and I felt the tremor at the tips of my fingers that betrayed more than physical fatigue. I scrubbed my hands until they burned and the skin went white and wrinkled. Scrubbing is a motion of control. Roy's absence pressed like a missing stitch. I rang Joe's diner and the waitress said, "No sign, Frank, he hasn't been in since the 15th. Once, at the counter, he'd grinned and said, "You keep the lights on, Mallory. I'll bring the jokes later." Now the booth was empty and the ashtray cold. Absence was another kind of answer. I began to inventory not just objects but omissions: who signed reports late, who filed forms as clerical, who turned their face when a neighbor's child went missing. Each notation in my ledger felt like tallying a ledger of sin. My pen scratched 11/1957, audit of reports requested. It felt absurdly bureaucratic to try and pin down complicity. A late night, I stood before the necropsy glass and watched my reflection break across the cracks. In the fissures, I could see other faces: Mrs. Harlan, who used to complain about porch lights, the county clerk with her neat handwriting, my mother's face folded into a recipe card. The mirror didn't accuse so much as clarify. The monsters wore gloves and schedules. The Philco whispered again, and this time the cadence matched a phrase I'd written in the margin of my ledger earlier. We made room. I pressed my ear to the speaker until the plastic warmed, and for a panicked second I wondered if the radio had learned to read our confessions. I turned the dial. Between farm reports and weather, only a thin hiss remained. In the end, the question slid under everything I could record. How far does consent to fear reach? I sat at the prep table, the stainless steel cold beneath my palm, and felt the truth like frost. The terror wasn't only something that arrived from outside. It had been woven into daily patience, into polite turns of phrase, into the small silences that build a place where men can do what no one names. December 1957. The GE fluorescent over the prep table hummed its tired note, and the sodium lamp outside on Pine Street flashed like a slow, indifferent heartbeat. I am Frank Mallory, and the Philco on the shelf no longer filled the room with static. Only the sharp, thin sound of wind pushed along Route 23. The hospital still smelled of formaldehyde and the faint, burnt leather that had clung to me since Guy's barn. The odor sat under everything like a promise. I opened my ledger and wrote without flourish, "True monsters never left." The line came from my mother's diary and from the ledger of the town at once. Dr. Bennett shuffled past with a paper cup in his hand and peered at my entry. "You planning to close up for good, Frank?" he asked, voice rough. I said nothing at first. Discipline feels like silence sometimes. Routine kept me honest. I checked the Eagle cooler, 36 degrees Fahrenheit steady on the dial, logged biopsy jars with indelible ink, and inspected the bone saw, serial B1947, before I bagged it. Scalpel number 10 sat in the sterile tray, spare number 11 beside it. Forceps stamped Forensic 1949 clamped on the towel. When you list your tools, fear can't claim the language. Plainfield carried on with a thin, polite normality. Captain Thomas Harrigan had signed off boxes stamped 57/16 closed, and the Tribune printed photos that tried to frame horror as history. Still, the mud on my boots from Miller Road wouldn't wash out, and the smear of diesel and clay under my nails refused the neatness of headlines. I drove past the Gain property on a slow afternoon and found children at the sagging fence, red mittens bright against the grey. They skidded on the farm lane and laughed like they had no ledger to mark. "Mallory," one called, waving a stick like a flag. Their voices made my chest tight in a way no autopsy had. At Joe's Diner, the waitress, Evelyn, slid a plate toward me and said, "You can't carry all of it, Frank. Some things you gotta set down." I chewed and said, "And go where?" She touched my hand for a second, practical pity in her fingers, then went back to folding napkins. People offer small absolutions. They don't change anything. Sleep had become a series of short circuits. The Elgin on my wrist kept time while my nights shortened into minutes. A tremor ran from my fingertips to my wrist that I blamed on cold and habit. The metallic taste visited after midnight, and the Philco's faint echo sometimes sounded like my own voice calling across a hollow room. I checked the breaker box once a week out of habit. Mortuary proc, 20 amp for prep lights, even though a breaker won't reset a town. I took inventory of omissions as much as objects. Reports filed late. A missing name in the clerk's ledger. A neighbor who said he didn't hear anything. Those blanks read like maps. Discipline had taught me to record date, case, time, signature. Now I used the same form to list the town's small refusals. Roy left a message on the hospital extension once in early December, and it ended with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You keep the lights on, Mallory. I'll be around," he said. I called back and got the click of an unanswered line. Later, someone mentioned his name in a police roster with an annotation that didn't match the original. Absence, I learned, is a shape. I walked the corridor under the flicker of the sodium lamp and touched the stainless steel of the prep table. Cold bit into my palm and I felt steadier for it. The Philco sighed wind through its grill, and between weather reports, it offered nothing but thin hiss. In the small archive under the stairs, my mother's handwriting seemed larger, her admonition cleaving to me. The true monster is the one we invite in. I wrote the line again in the ledger in block letters. True monsters never left. The entry felt like a diagnosis. I signed and dated it, Inc. 12/10/57. There is a clerical finality to a signature. It pretends closure. I closed the ledger and put it in my coat like a man carrying a small hot coal. The morning I decided to leave, I gathered the routine. Gloves, ledger, brass key to the padlock, with a mechanic's care. I checked the cooler one last time, the compressor ticking like a small engine at idle. I checked the fuse box, spares in the drawer, BX cable secured, junctions taped. The checklist steadied my hands even as my resolve wavered. I walked out into a wind that cut across Route 23 like a blade and watched the children again near the Gein fence, their red mittens a smear against the grey field. Their laughter echoed off the sagging barn as if memory could be smoothed over by play. I felt a surge of something like anger and something like grief. "Take care of yourself, Frank," Evelyn called from the diner. "Don't make it last longer than it has to." I nodded and didn't answer. At the padlock, the brass key turned with a resistance I'd learned to trust. The lock clicked and the door gave its tired groan. I ran a hand across the paint at palm height, almost unconsciously, and the tip of my finger snagged on new grooves. Shallow scratches, clustered and recent, no larger than a child's fingernail. The sight of them put a frost under my sternum. I walked away with the ledger under my arm and the image of those scratches behind my eyes. The Philco's last whisper chased me. Just wind now, but somehow it carried the cadence of footsteps. The winter kept breathing down the town's neck, and Plainfield kept its small silences. I understood then that locking a door does not end what is kept inside. It simply changes who listens when the steps begin again.